the edge of the world, there's a tiny island about 4 kilometers south of the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica. Though the island has no proper designation, my associates stationed at the neighboring Scott base have officially dubbed it Nothing Island on account of its uninteresting nature. Scans have shown that the entire island is nothing but ice, so no government has decided to waste their money on any kind of knowledge-gathering mission. Most researchers in Antarctica are there especially to observe changes in the climate. They study rocks, measure sea level rises in the single digits of micrometers, and engage in other agonizingly boring activities. Some researchers, however, are in Antarctica to study Arctic animals. I am one of these scientists, and I noticed a bizarre behavioral pattern among the emperor penguins in the area. They are drawn to Nothing Island and have been almost ritualistically abandoning their colonies to attempt the journey. Leaving their colonies is certain death, and they're smart enough to know it, but with reckless abandon, increasing numbers of them attempt to swim over to an island with nothing on it for reasons impossible for any human to understand. We're not supposed to bring the rogue penguins back to their colonies or impede their journey, in spite of our empathetic human instinct. Nobody was happy about that, but Isla was inconsolable. She always had tears in her eyes watching the penguins on their death march. I wish I could remember her with tears in her eyes, or with the smile she always had when the baby penguins did something funny. Instead, when I think of her trembling hands, white-knuckled, clutching a massive chef's knife. There was a wild look in her eyes as we tried to talk her down from whatever psychosis had taken hold. It was no use, and we knew that, but there was nothing else to try. We kept asking her what she wanted, but she refused to answer. It was late, probably close to midnight, and Theodore found her trying to leave the facility wearing nothing but her loose-fitting flannel pajamas. When he asked what she was doing, she scrambled to the kitchen and produced the knife. Her crazed scrambling woke everyone up, and here we all were, trying to reason with a woman who simply was not there anymore. When somebody attempted a step towards her, something changed in an instant as she threw the knife at Henry, our supervisor. She missed by a wide margin, and the knife uselessly thumped against the wall. Before it could even clatter the floor, Isla was a blur, instantly propelled into a dead sprint towards the open kitchen door. Unfortunately, Theodore was able to grab hold of her. Before anyone could even register the fact that Henry wasn't hit by the knife, her thumbnail was buried in Theodore's eye. There was a spurt of blood, and he started screaming. He released his grip on Isla, and she was gone in the blink of an eye. Theo fell to the ground in dismayed agony, and while everyone was checking to be sure he was okay, I frantically threw my winter clothes on and chased Isla out of the facility. In the impenetrable Antarctic darkness, it was nearly impossible to identify her footprints in the snow. I didn't even register the fact that she was moving in the direction of Nothing Island until I saw a vague human silhouette ominously planted at the shoreline. My approach was hesitant, but such caution was unnecessary as her violent mania from earlier had subsided and an eerie calm had taken over. She wasn't even shaking in the cold. She said something, but I couldn't hear her over the deafening winds. I remember shouting, but I couldn't hear her, and I remember her smiling. With an expression of pure bliss on her face, she raised her right arm, which was still speckled with half-frozen beads of Theodore's blood, and pointed toward Nothing Island. I gazed out into the darkness with her, and saw a light so bright it was a wonder nobody ever noticed it before. Isla was still smiling when she took the first step into the frigid waters. I didn't dare make a move to stop her as she took step after effortless step toward the light. I stayed at the shore until I lost sight of her. which was around the time the light burned out as quickly as it had appeared. Henry and the others, excluding Theodore, finally found me and brought me back to the base. Isla's blue bloated corpse washed up the next morning. Her blood was frozen and she was still smiling. I remember thinking she would never stop. More penguins continued making the journey to Nothing Island until eventually Henry determined that it was finally worth it to plan an excursion. Emperor penguins are a near-threatened species, and it was careless of us to let them commit to what essentially amounted to suicide in massive numbers for no reason. The rest of us agreed with his rationale, so him and 3 of his most trusted associates were off. They broadcasted their findings live to the rest of us so that, in the case of hostile wildlife, we were called for backup. As soon as the 4 men sailed roughly a kilometer away from mainland Antarctica, the broadcast completely cut out. I remember a sickly sinking feeling taking hold of me as I processed what was certainly the deaths of 4 co-workers and dear friends. We resolved to contact our higher-ups back home and let them know what was happening if the broadcast didn't return by morning the next day. I was designated to be in charge of the broadcast, so I was set up to be notified in the event the stream saw any activity. Thankfully, there was no need for that as Henry and his men returned. The way they described it, a winter storm that occurred on the way to the island made it impossible to navigate the furious Antarctic waters. Rather than attempt the rest of the hopeless journey to Nothing Island, Henry made the brave and noble decision to retreat to the relative safety of Scott Base. Unfortunately, the expensive broadcasting equipment was lost in the storm. Nobody really cared about that. We were mostly relieved that our friends survived. My months-long term at Scott Base was nearing its end, and I was just happy I didn't have to endure a second tragedy before returning home to my family. A couple of days before I was slated to leave, I was notified of broadcast activity from the lost equipment. At first, I figured the notification was to let me know that the broadcast completely shut off, or the equipment was destroyed or something. When I turned the stream on, I was met with a nearly pitch-black screen. It was so dark I thought for a moment that the camera somehow turned back on when it hit the bottom of the ocean. I would have turned the stream off if not for the vague sense of movement in the footage. When I turned the brightness up, I was able to make out what could only be described as a frozen hellscape which stretched further than the eye could see, beyond the very curvature of the earth itself. Golf ball-sized clumps of snow and hail relentlessly beat down from the skies, and the howling winds sent a chill down my spine. At Scott Base, it was daytime, but the footage showed almost no light at all, certainly not from the sun. There weren't even any stars in the sky, only a stagnant and infinitely thick void. The broadcast panned to a view of 4 small tents and a hastily made fishing hole located maybe a couple hundred meters away. The camera was shaken violently as the operator moved closer to the tents. Over the blowing winds, I was becoming increasingly aware of the inconsistent rasping breaths from behind the camera. When it was only a couple meters away from the tents, the approach halted suddenly. The breathing quieted too, just enough to make out the sound of snoring coming from inside the tent. The camera turned to reveal the operator. Even in the dark, I could make out the smile Isla had when she originally set off to Nothing Island. She was deathly pale and had adopted an eerie gauntness to her frame, but the manic joy shined through her smile more brilliantly than ever. The last frame before the stream cut out was that intense and horrible smile. Nothing Island still visits me in my dreams. I sail away, but no matter which direction I go, I end up at Nothing Island. There is beauty in the endless expanse of white-packed ice. I cannot see its end, And there are emperor penguins and Isla holds my hand and I want for nothing. The dream always ends when the light gets too bright for me to bear.